Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to draw a knob form in graphite. We are going to begin by thinking about the axis of symmetry of this form. If you're in the classroom today, I want to recommend that you try doing this drawing sight-sized. Or if you otherwise have the ability to put your drawing next to the monitor. Sight size means that you will put your paper on a clipboard next to the screen and you will draw your drawing exactly the same size as it appears on the screen. And that's what I'm going to do on my screen. You see I'm carrying these lines across, and sight size is a very useful technique for improving your proportions. A little history lesson is that in the distant past, most artists seem to have done their portraits sight size. We know this because portraits are almost always, in portraits in museums are almost always a little bit smaller than life size, which means that if the artist was painting the picture, the model is sitting near the canvas but a little bit behind it, the artist steps away from the canvas and from the right distance away, the face in the painting is going to be exactly the same size as the face in real life. And that's what you're seeing me do here. So if you're able to do that, do it. You can carry the lines all the way across onto your paper. So our next step so having determined our main vertical proportions, we're now ready to think about horizontal proportions. And we're going to start with the width of this knob. And we're going to ask ourselves about the proportions of this shape, which does not look like a square, does it? If we look at if we box in this knob, you see how it's about 20% wider than a square? Now, if you are working sight size, let me get caught up here. So I've got a line here, 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 and here. There's my vertical axis. If you're working sight size, you can actually measure, using your pencil and your fingers, you can measure the width of the photograph, and then you can carry it over to your drawing like this. I'm going to do it by eye, and what I'm seeing here is something that is about 20% wider than it is tall, so that's what I'm drawing. Now I'm going to look at these arcs inside the corners. Notice that there's a little flattening at the top and there's a little flattening at the sides. So unlike an ellipse, where our challenge was to make the arcs go all the way to the center of the form, on this form the arcs do not go all the way to the center of the edges of the rectangle. So we're going to block that in. And now we're going to ask ourselves, thinking fractionally again, how wide is the neck? And it looks to me like these lines are just a little closer to the outside of the head than they are to the, we'll call this the spine, the vertical axis. So I'm going to put this here and this here. Everyone follow me here? This unit here is a little wider than this unit here. Now, before we try to draw these curves, we want to ask ourselves, how far out does this curve come? And we can see we have a nice kind of interval here where this is our biggest unit here to here, and then this is a little smaller, and then this is even smaller. So if we create one last unit that's a little smaller than the middle one, you see what I just did? This is like a nice sequence of diminishing sizes. And we got big, smaller, smallest. And that's going to define the boundaries of what we're going to call the body of the form. And our challenge is to draw this sort of a light bulb shape inside these boundaries. But let's find one last landmark. This is where the body, the apex of this curve, and notice it's about 1/3 of the way up the body. So if we go 1/3 of the way up, this is where we should be hitting. Here and here. And all this measuring is going to help us keep the form symmetrical. Last thing you want is to have a lopsided knob. And there it is. So make whatever adjustments you need in order to achieve symmetry. The reason I like to draw these forms is because shading them is a lot like shading a human face or figure. Because we are likewise made up out of rounded forms that project out over other rounded forms. So this rounded form here of the body is throwing a reflected light up under the rounded form of the head. This projecting form in the feet is, or the foot is reflecting light up under the belly, and so forth. Exactly as you would find in a human. Okay, the base of this thing is exactly as wide as the body. And we already marked where the bottom of the base is. So what we're looking for here, as you may have guessed, is this is half of an ellipse, just like the base of a cylinder. You see that? And the apex of these curves is about here, which means if we finished the cylinder, it would come up almost to the bottom of the belly. So what we're going to do now is draw, for starters, draw this ellipse. Make sure you make this curve round enough. All my students really want to flatten this out because they know it's on a flat table and they think the bottom has to be flat. Pretty basic misunderstanding. So notice that this curves up a little higher in back because it has thickness, like that. And then there's a secondary ellipse that kind of overlaps it, like this. And if you look carefully, you can see that these curves come around behind this bottom ellipse. If I check the width of that bottom ellipse, I could say it's about almost as wide as the head. You see that? So if we come down from the head, that's about where the outside of that ellipse should be. One of the secrets of drawing is to learn to relate forms to each other that are not next to each other. Most people are good at relating forms, adjacent forms, like relating this to this, this to this, this to this, this to this. But few people without training are going to think to look like, well, how does this curve relate to this curve up here? Because they're at opposite ends of the form. And the last step for the outline is this little transition. We've got this little curb form here, and it transitions into this bottom of the belly, and there's a slight overlap here. This is the part that gives people the most trouble because there's a series of overlaps. This overlaps this, and this overlaps this. Okay, so it would be tempting to try to make this drawing, these outlines perfect, and then start shading. That's how a lot of people draw. What I want to convince you is that that's not a very efficient way to draw, because your outlines are not going to reveal their flaws until you've shaded them. Because until you've shaded them, your brain sees them as flat, not three-dimensional, and it's very hard to assess them. So what we're going to do next is we're going to shadow map this. We're done worrying about site size. We're doing a drawing that's the same size as the reference. So you can always check a measurement from the reference and apply it to your drawing. But we are now going to focus on shadow mapping one form at a time. And I think it'll be useful to zoom in a little and use a little bit of fractional thinking and a little bit of our knowledge of light. So if I throw a light line on here, this is where the terminator of the shadow ends. So a tangent to that would be roughly like this. And on the other side, it would be roughly like this. It's not exactly parallel because the light source is pretty close to the object. Actually, they're a little more parallel than that because we actually have a clue over here. See where that cast shadow ends? That's going to give us a good idea of our light line on this side. So the light's going about like this. So that's one way to think about it. Another way is to use fractional thinking and ask ourselves, how far up this form is the terminator or the shadow edge? Notice that it's about a third of the way up, right? Maybe a little less than a third. So I'm going to mark that proportion, a little less than a third of the way up. And I'm going to carry it around to the terminator on this side. And notice it comes down, it's lower on this side. There's my light line, sort of like this. It's just a little higher. See, it touches here, it drops down to here, but it's even higher on this side. We go from here down to here and then back up to here. Okay, to find where the shadow ends, cast shadow, I'm not seeing a convenient. So I'm saying, so we know the cast shadow starts about here, and I'm seeing this cast shadow being about twice as wide as this form shadow. So that brings us to about here with a secondary kind of diffusion shadow down below it like that. And now we're going to zoom out again. And then we're going to do a big zigzag around here. Again, this is our light direction, so we should be touching here and about here, which we are. And finally, the shadow on the ground. Well, we got the shadow on the base first. Here I'm really thinking about there's only one little piece of light on the base. It starts just below the curb and then it comes across and wraps around like that. It comes about 2/3 of the way around the form. And then there's a cast shadow on the ground. Again, using our light lines, we can anticipate this should be peaking right about here, curving around, and ending like that. So this is probably a step most of you are not used to doing in your drawings. Highly advisable to shadow map before you shade, and then to do first shading. And for this drawing, I'm going to do, so you got to erase your construction lines. I'm going to shade lefty today, so if you're right-handed, you're shading the other direction. But just block in one even tone over the entire shadow map, anywhere that's not in the light. Use light pressure and lots of lines if you want to make an even tone. The more complex the form happens to be, the more essential this stage of the process becomes, because when the form is really complex, you're more apt to make mistakes, and if you make mistakes, then you need a chance to correct them. And that's what this process is going to give us. So just shade neatly up to the edges of your shadow map, medium gray tone. Don't worry about making your soft edges yet. So you may know how beginning writers write they write a sentence and then they backspace out of that sentence. They write it again and they do it a third time. And they're pretty much editing everything they do as they go, partly because they're insecure and they think their writing probably sucks. And so, beginning writers. Those are very bad writing habits. And what I'm trying to do is to get you out of the habit of drawing that way. So what we just made was a first draft of this form. And we didn't do a whole lot of editing as we went. But now what you have on your paper is a pattern in black and white that corresponds very closely to the pattern of the photograph. And this is your opportunity. This is like finishing the first draft of a paper. This is your opportunity to take a few steps back and look back and forth quickly and use your brain's ability to recognize patterns to tell you ways that the pattern in your drawing might be a little different than the pattern in the photograph. For example, I'm seeing that this shoulder form in my drawing is a little higher on the left than it is on the right. And so I'm going to just bring this down a tiny bit and try to achieve a little more symmetry. And that was not something I noticed in the outline drawing, but it's something I noticed now that I have a shaded study. So I'm going to challenge all of you to find one or two corrections to make, and then we'll return to the lesson. Okay, now that we've made our corrections, we're going to zoom in. Let's stay zoomed out. We're just going to stay where we are, but we're going to start drawing some details. And we're going to use the shading directions. Shading directions is the same for everybody now, and it corresponds to what we've already studied. So we recently drew eggs, and we learned to curve our lines this way around the form to sharpen this edge. Okay, I'll get closer after all. Okay, so we're putting your pencil down in the core shadow and shading up towards the light. If your shadow map is at all dark or getting in the way, erase it. When you have more practice and skill, you should make your shadow map so faint that you don't even need to do that step. But right now, some of your shadow maps are pretty dark, so you want to get them out of the way. And every stroke, watch carefully. You put your pencil down in the core shadow, and you shade up towards the light. And we start out curving with the form. As we move towards the center, our lines become purely vertical. And then as we move to the left, they start curving the other way. So what we end up with is nice sharp edges at the outside of the form where it meets that light background. And we end up with nice soft edges through where the light moves gradually into shadow. So just like with the egg, what you'll find is that now this boundary here is a little too sharp. So we're going to shade down towards the reflected light from the core shadow, like this. With the same line direction. And now I'm going to go up again, but with slightly longer lines just to get this, make this edge look a little softer. And I'm using a lighter pressure. And I'm just getting that nice gradual transition from dark to light. Always putting your pencil down in the darkest area and releasing it into the lighter area. It does not work to shade, if you're still shading like this, if you're still shading up and down, you have no control this way. Okay, you've got to learn to shade from the dark towards the light and make every pencil stroke do what you want the transition to do. Okay, this was like drawing an egg. This next step is like drawing a cylinder because we've got a rounded neck form. And we're going to curve our strokes very slightly around that form as we darken inside the cast shadow. And in order to sharpen these outside edges, we're going to have to switch to a vertical direction, and these are our sharpening strokes, and these also create a nice feeling of cross-hatching through this form. This gets really dark through here. This is what's called an occlusion shadow. There's really no light bouncing under the top of the neck here, so you can go as dark as you want. So there's a really important idea in drawing and painting called simultaneous contrast. And that idea is that when an area has dark around it, it's going to look lighter than it is, and when an area has light around it, it's going to look darker than it is. So when we go back and look at our original source photograph, we see a pretty strong reflected light under here. Most beginners are going to actually read that as much too bright, and they're going to make it too bright. What I want to do is, in fact, most beginners are going to make this reflected light similar in value to this halftone up here. See, this is a halftone, this is a reflected light. I just want to show you how different they are. I'm going to take a color sample from the brightest part of the reflected light here, which is this. You see that? I'm making a shape that's that value. And I'm going to use that same color up here in the halftone to show you how much darker it is. So this is how dark the reflected light is. It looks a lot darker when you throw it up here, right, than when you have it down here. But these are exactly the same value. And I can prove that if I can connect them, and you can see that they are exactly the same value. Is that making sense to everybody? So let me get rid of this window now. And go back to this one. So that's telling me that this reflected light in my drawing is now looking way too bright. Can you start to see that? Yeah. So in order to flatten this area out, I can go back to my first shading direction and just hatch over it without losing a sense that there is some reflected light in there. And I can also do a little more contour shading. What I'm doing is I'm just knocking that reflected light back, and now I think it looks a lot more believable. Okay, moving downward, we can get fancy and do some contour shading that splays out a little bit. You see what I'm doing? When I'm contour shading, I'm basically pretending that I'm touching the form with my pencil. And the beauty of that is that the drawing begins to show the artist's understanding of the form and not just the values. And in a world that's really oversaturated with photography, that makes this kind of drawing a very special thing. It's actually, people tend to be overly impressed with artists who can make drawings that look just like photographs. A good drawing, in my mind, really transcends a photograph. It's at the same time simpler than a photograph and also more descriptive of the form than a photograph.
Why? It's about what people see instead of what's factual, is it?
It's more descriptive because I can, as I can hold the shape in my hand, I can look at it from all angles, I can understand it, and I can use my understanding of the form, which the camera lacks, to do this kind of contour shading that demonstrates what the form is doing. Now, I have no doubt that in about 15 minutes, AI is going to be able to do the same thing, but for now, it's still kind of special. Yep. And I think with regards to AI that people are always drawn to art as a form of communication, person to person. And one thing that makes drawing and painting special compared to, say, like videos and film and video games, like most of those other entertainments are collaborative efforts. In other words, like hundreds or thousands of people work on them. And as you know from conversation, there's really something special about one-on-one relationships, one-on-one communication. And a good drawing or painting is that. It's sort of one soul reaching out through time and space toward another. Without getting too metaphysical, I think it's important. I mean, it remains to be seen whether there will be interest. Like, for example, would you rather read a mediocre book by a human or the most entertaining book in the world written by AI? That's an open question. Yeah, I don't know. When I read a book, I feel like I'm getting to know somebody.
Yeah, I'm the same. I would not want to be looked by AI. I don't think AI has all the ability to do what humans can do, which is. And I don't think they have the full ability to create AI. Yeah, because like every time ChatGPT. Yeah, like when you ask ChatGPT, you're like, make me a song. You know, it's always like one of the lines that is like gibberish. It's what? Gibberish. I think they did that. I don't get that with ChatGPT at all. I think that humans have Yep.
Okay.
Humans have mutated an ability to think sentient. Forget the philosophy.
So here we go. This is our core shadow. And there's another, can everyone see that reflected light under here?
Yeah.
Now, learning to shade is sort of like learning to inhabit a backwards world. Because every beginner is used to thinking about like, oh, things that face down are darker and things that face up are lighter, because that's the logic of light. But when you look carefully inside of shadows, the opposite happens. Things that face down are lighter because they get reflected light. Things that face up are darker. For example, right above this little curb is a core shadow. It's very dark here where we're facing upward. And it's a fairly sharp edge, so I'm going to actually use a little bit of a sharpening stroke to define this edge. And the same thing happens right below the curb. This also faces up. The curb itself faces out towards us, and so it's getting a little bit of reflected light, and we're going to leave that alone. But the interesting thing that happens is there's often core shadows like here where the shadow gets the darkest right before it breaks out into the light. Isn't there a saying that something's darkest right before the dawn? No one's ever heard that?
I understand the concept.
The sky's darkest right before the dawn. It's kind of like that. The core shadow's darkest right before it breaks out into light. So try to follow my shading direction as much as you can. Here I'm doing more contour shading with these inward curves, and I'm going to crosshatch again with some cylinder shading going around. We're almost creating like a topographical map of the form, if that makes any sense. And when we come down here, this part of the cast shadow that faces up is the darkest. And here's the core shadow of the foot. It's amazing how many people miss the fact that this is shadow down here, because the reflected light here is so bright, but notice it's still shadow, still facing away from the light. And then when we get to the shadow accent on the ground, we're going to do a little sharpening of the outside of the edge of the form, transitioning to horizontal. So at this point in the drawing, we want to like take a longer view of everything, back up a little, which I'm going to do virtually by making these things smaller. Get your drawing as close to the reference as you can get it. And now we're kind of looking for how successful we were at getting the overall effect. And my final touches are going to involve some halftones. There's a halftone here, halftone, a little more of a halftone extending beyond this form shadow, a little bit over here. So I don't do first shading for my halftones, I just do the contour shading. And we could also mark our horizon and do a little bit of first shading on that back wall to bring out the light on the head of the form. And I think my final step, remember I flattened out this reflected light, it was a little too bright. I'm going to flatten this zone out now too, just go back to my first shading direction. I want that reflected light to be legible, but I don't want it to be too bright. It's very subtle. Okay, I'm going to come around and take a look at what you've done. If you're watching this at home, thanks for watching as usual.